The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Charter Commission Rent Stabilization Work Group will now begin.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Charter Commission's Rent Stabilization Work Group. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota Statutes Section 13D.021 due to the declared local health pandemic. The city will be recording and posting this meeting to the city's website and YouTube channel as a means of increasing public access and transparency. This meeting is public and subject to the Minnesota Open Meeting Law. For the record, my name is Jan Sandberg, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Charter Commission's Rent Stabilization Work Group. I will now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk, please call the roll so we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Perry?
Here.
Commissioner Rubenstein?
Here.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf?
Present.
Commission Chair Clegg? Co-Chair Ginder?
Present.
And Co-Chair Sandberg?
Present.
There are 5 members present.
Thank you. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I please have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved, Rubenstein.
Is there a second?
Second, Ginder.
Thank you. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? Seeing none or hearing none, I'll ask the clerk to please call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Perry?
Aye.
Commissioner Rubenstein?
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf?
Aye.
Commission Chair Clegg? Co-Chair Ginder?
Aye.
And Co-Chair Sandberg?
Aye.
There are 5 ayes.
Thank you. Commissioners, there are minutes from our regular meeting of March 27th, 2021 that need to be accepted. May I have a motion to accept these minutes?
So moved, Rubenstein.
Second, Ginder.
There is a motion before us. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I will again ask the clerk to call the roll on this motion.
Commissioner Perry?
Aye.
Commissioner Rubenstein?
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf?
Aye.
Commission Chair Clegg? Co-Chair Sandberg?
Aye.
And Co-Chair Ginder?
Aye.
There are 5 ayes.
That motion passes. The minutes are accepted. Thank you. Item 4 on the agenda is the chair's report, and I don't have a whole lot other than what we're going to be discussing in a few minutes, other than to remind people that if you are interested in the City Council's approach to these 2 amendments and they're thinking about them, you might want to listen in to the February 10th POGO meeting, the discussions near the end of the meeting. It's on YouTube, of course. The February 23rd Council study session also had some discussion, and the comments from the public hearing we've discussed before. The public hearing's quite long, and most of those comments did focus on the substance of rent control, not these amendments. There was a City Council meeting at February 26th to put the amendments on, send them to the Charter Commission. They did a separate vote on them, but there was no discussion that was substantive. And I find that very interesting because I've been searching high and low to try and find some discussion of the initiative portion, particularly amendment. And if somebody else can find it, please send me a note because I would love to read about it. Other than that, we will move forward to the next item on our agenda, which is item 5. This is considering a proposal to amend Article 4 in the city charter to explicitly add the city's authority to exercise power to control rents on private residential property in the city. And I should mention, I asked Maddie to put a variety of documents into the packet so that you would have background easily available to you. The first document, I believe, was the state statute governing rent control. It has in its subdivision 2 both sections of the, the 2 amendments, the initiative part, and then also the city council's part. But part of what we want to do at this meeting today is make sure that we have adequately heard from Attorney Bashoon, who has kindly written several memos and provided some revised language for these two amendments. I know that she briefly addressed the initiative part, I think the meeting before last. I'd like to get to that at the next item, but if she would please just briefly update us on her memo that she sent, which is in your packet, about revised language and the issues that she discovered, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Chair Sandberg. I did provide a memo dated May 6th, and I basically addressed the two charter amendments that are before you, the two rent control charter amendments. One is to section 1.4 and the other is to section 4.1. So yes, if you stop there, under number 1, I mentioned some just general errors that are in the sections. One, and it's in both sections 1.4 and 4.1, and they relate to the statute. The rent control statute says that in order to allow a city to do rent control, it has to be voted at a general election. The language in the proposed amendment says a general or special election, but apparently the legislatures believe that it has to be done at a general election. So those are some of the changes that are made to both sections 1.4 and 4.1. And I have to apologize, I'm getting a lot of work done at my house today. HVAC and AC and water tank, so. So 1.4 is basically the ordinance that relates to what the city council can do to try to enact rent control. And 4.1 is what we call the initiative, where a voter can put forth an ordinance that would regulate rents in the city. So under number 2, I've mentioned under section 1.4, one of the things that I thought should be changed on that is that typically with from what I've seen with the typical initiative, voters can provide an ordinance to the city, and the city can say, yes, I'd like to enact that ordinance as is, and then that ordinance becomes the ordinance of the city. However, with rent control, it's not that easy. Under the statute for rent control, that it states that that ordinance still has to go to the voters, and that has to be voted at a general election. So when the ordinance was written, it allowed for some options. Basically, what would happen is the voters would put together a petition. If that petition is done properly and it meets all the technical requirements and the number of signatures required, then the city council has to make a decision what it will do. And there are some different options in the particular amendments. One is to enact the ordinance without change, and I believe that is no longer valid because technically under the statute for rent control, it has to be sent to the voters if you want to enact the ordinance. So basically the changes that I have recommended are to remove the ability to enact the ordinance without change. So the city council would have two options. If the petition meets all the technical, or the initiative petition meets all the technical requirements, the city council would be able to either send it to the voters, put it on the ballot, or the city council would be able to rely on a legal opinion and decide not to put it on the ballot. That legal opinion is based on law, and basically the city is not required to put on the ballot anything that is against the Constitution or state law or state policy. So if that was the situation, it would not go to the ballot. Otherwise, the city council would send it to the ballot. Or, excuse me, send it to the voters. So those are the changes I recommend, and I do have a cold too, so.
I'm sorry. Two questions. One, just because we have some people who may be viewing this later, could you just say a few words on the difference between the special and general elections? Because I believe that the general they are different, and I won't try to be a lawyer.
Yes, a general election is set up by statute. It's an election that's always occurring on a certain date. Like you might think of, your typical November 2nd date. It's always occurring, it's always set up. A special election is what you call when you need to do something in between those normal dates. A special election could be, say, for example, if somebody resigns from the city council, and to resign in the middle of a term. So we may hold a special election to get somebody elected into that position because we don't need it. We don't want it to be vacant for 2 years. So that would be when we call a special election. There may be other times in the statutes where you can have a special election if you have an initiative by voters, but the state law for rent control doesn't allow you to do those special elections. So basically, we'd have to do it on a regular general election day. Presumably, I can't speculate, but the legislature may have thought that there are more voters on general election days than special election days.
Okay, thank you. And my other quick question is, if there is an initiative that's sent to the city council, can they change it? Can they modify the terms of what's sent to them to put on the ballot? Or are they restricted to what actually comes in on the petition?
Yeah, under this language, they would have to use the language that was provided by the voters.
Okay, thank
So
you.
if the initiative petition did have specific language, they could not change it, and they would have to either send it to the voters or not send it because of a legal issue.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the work group members have questions for Attorney Bashoon on her memo? We're going to go right next to the ordinance itself. Okay, I think maybe, oh, good. Commissioner Schwarzkopf, since you had questions earlier.
Yes, I have two questions. The first question is, could the petition that's being proposed and signed, could that say that the city council had the right to pass any kind of ordinance they want to in regards to rent control?
Oh. I don't know if Attorney Bashoon wants to answer that, or.
I mean, that sounds very speculative, but I would think that really wouldn't. You could argue that that's not a true rent control ordinance, which actually does the actual control of the rents. So you could argue that that is not valid. It's just giving the city council authority, kind of like a charter amendment would. So I think one could argue that that would not fit within the statute.
Thank you. And Commissioner Schwarzkopf, you had another question, I believe.
Yes, my second question is in regard to 6B, where it says more than half of the voters must cast in order to win. And the other amendment that's proposed that talks about 51%.
Oh, that's, okay, go on, I'm sorry. Okay, the one that's proposed is, we'll talk about later, that came from Commissioner Ginder, but I think that Attorney Bashoon's language is majority, I believe. Wait, where is it?
Yes.
Simple majority.
Yeah, my language relates to majority. The 51% relates to charter amendments. And since this is an initiative, that statute doesn't necessarily apply. From the case law that I've seen, typically initiatives are by a majority vote. And so that's why that's why that language is in there. Technically, I mean, I think technically you could make a different change to it, but I think from what I've seen, typically everything's done by a majority. I know the charter amendment changes are done by 51%, and that's specific to charter amendments, so we have to follow that. And maybe the courts have, I don't think the courts have looked at that issue very much, but there is a big difference. Like I did calculations based on what the mayor's election, the last mayor's election, and how many people voted for the mayor. And I calculated that if that many people voted for a ballot question, at the same amount that voted for the mayor, if we're looking at the majority versus 51%, there's about $1,000 people difference. So there is a difference between them, but I think for the initiative, it's not required like a charter amendment to have 51%. So technically you could do the majority vote.
Okay, and when we get, if it's okay, can we discuss Commissioner Ginder's proposal a little bit further down the line when we get to probably the item after this and after the rest of the questions are asked? Okay, Commissioner Rubenstein, I'm sorry, I don't know who's next.
Thank you. I may be jumping ahead, but I'm just trying to figure out where we are. And as I understand what Ms. Bashoon has presented to us in this first memo, it's really assuming we decide to accept the City Council proposed amendment, then we'd still have to make these technical changes. And I guess my question is, we still have to decide whether we want to accept the amendment or not. And particularly, do we have the option, and again, maybe this is jumping ahead, to say select giving the City Council the authority to enact an ordinance, which would then go to the voters, and not accept the authority under the Charter for Initiative, which could end up with a very messy ordinance eventually. Just, anyways, is that for a later discussion?
Isn't this two charter amendments? They're two separate charter amendments, I think.
Right.
So what I would assume that we could handle them separately, but I bet Commissioner Ginder, who is blinking on my screen, might have a thought about that. Commissioner Ginder.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I wanted to say that with regard to the corrections proposed by City Attorney Bashoon, I believe that those corrections were necessary and make that section 1.4 legal. And so that kind of ties then into Commissioner Rubenstein's question is, yes, there still has to be a decision. If we want to do a substitute motion, which could include sending, well, we could send it back as is and say, yeah, we approve it, put it on the ballot, even though we know that there are errors in it. We could send it back saying, yeah, we think it should go on the ballot, but here's our substitute, which is corrected. So it conforms with the law as proposed by Ms. Bashoon. Or we could kind of say, no, we don't want to do either one of those. We reject the whole idea of initiative. And then that still leaves a discussion on the referendum portion of it, in my mind, where you could say, again, there are corrections made in the referendum, which we'll talk about coming up. And we could propose sending that back as is, as corrected, or not at all, or with our own corrections. And I just threw together a sample that would be something that I think is legally correct, and I did put in something different for the number of votes for discussion purposes. But that's a later discussion, but that's kind of the overview is how I see it. So what we could send back could include both initiative and referendum, only one of them, or we say reject the whole thing.
Thank you. That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify it.
Right. No, I don't think that our discussion today is by any means saying, yeah, we think everything's a great idea with a few technical changes. That is not the position of this work group as far as I'm aware. But we do want to get as much information about the technical issues as we can before we move to that final decision, I think. Anyway, okay, Commissioner Perry.
Yes,
You're-
I just, thank you, Madam Chair. What I want to just make sure I'm understanding Commissioner Ginder saying is that we can advance these as separate items and we don't have to take them as a group, even though they have been presented as them as a group of amendments, proposed amendments.
And it could be a question for Commissioner Ginder or for Attorney Bashoon, either one.
Because,
Commissioner Ginder?
yeah,
Yes, yes, these are two separate ordinances, so you can treat them separately. They would be two separate ballot questions if they would both get on the ballot, so that's why they've been written as two separate ordinances. So yes, you should be able to treat each one separately and decide whether you want to accept, reject, or propose a substitute. So you can do that for both of them individually.
Thank you.
thanks.
Okay. Commissioner Schwarzkopf, your hand is up. Oh, Lyle?
Yes, the reason I raised my hand is no matter what the Charter Commission says as it relates to these two amendments, the city council can put on whatever they want to anyway. Is that correct?
I believe they have to I don't think they can go back and make big changes now. Commissioner Bashoon, Attorney Bashoon and Peter, whoever.
They can decide to put forward their original language or substitute language if the commission proposes substitute language, or they can decide not to put it on the ballot at all.
Right.
But they cannot make changes, so they have two choices, original or substitute, or if they're going to put it on the ballot.
Okay, and Commissioner Perry, your hand's up again?
Yes, so if we don't put forth a substitute motion that is accepted, and there are these legal inconsistencies with the amendments, the proposed amendments as we have been discussing, what is the, how does that get resolved? And I think this is for Attorney Bashoon. How does that get resolved? Because they basically have something that's not in line with state statute.
That's a good question. There are some attorney general opinions stating that even if there's some drafting errors to amendments to a charter, they can still be put on the ballot. So that would be a possibility. And if it in fact did get on the ballot and was passed, then a 13-0 vote by city council could be done to just fix those errors. Of course, other people, it could be challenged too. That's a possibility. Any kind of ballot question can be challenged before it gets on the ballot or as it's being placed on the ballot. There could be litigation afterwards too. But those are always possibilities for any kind of ballot question.
What do you mean, if I can follow up quick, what do you mean a 13-0 vote if it is that if it's gone on the ballot and is passed, there would be a 13-0 vote on something?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility if it's really an error and removing an error, that's a possibility to do a vote 13-0 of the council members to remove it. I don't think it would remove the substantive language of it. It would just be to remedy an error.
And so the mayor and the charter commission would be weighing in on that process?
No, that would be basically, it would be a change that would be done just by the charter, just by the city council. That's under 410.12. It's one of the ways to change the charter.
Okay,
Okay.
Commissioner Rubenstein and then Commissioner Ginder.
I was just going to remind us, as if we didn't know and wouldn't want, and actually don't want to know, that we can also put a charter amendment on the ballot ourselves. Not that we'd want to do it, I think, in this situation, but that's another option.
Oh, okay, and Commissioner Ginder?
I don't want to practice law since I'm no longer a licensed attorney. But with regard to Commissioner Perry's question, I think the most likely thing that would happen is the council would have the ability to put on a arguably defective ordinance to be or a ballot amendment to be voted on. And if passed, they would then be either required to follow what Ms. Bashoon believes is the correct law, that they could not do it at a special election, and that they could not just pass something that came up on an initiative. And so if they never did that, arguably there might never be a challenge to it. If they did try to do it at, say, a special election or to pass it, then there could be a challenge. Somebody could sue, say that it violates state law. And then a court would be faced with a question of, well, that's true, they can't do that. And then the question is, do they have to throw out the entire law, or can it be what they call severed and just say, well, that part of it is illegal, but the rest of it stands. And so there are a lot of options that would fall out there, but I don't think that they would necessarily be prohibited from putting on something that would be inconsistent with the law. But if challenged before a ballot, we might find out differently. I do disagree a little bit. The 13-0 vote, I think, could only happen after, for example, this ballot went on, this amendment went on the ballot and it were passed. And then later on, if they wanted to try and change it to correct those so-called inconsistencies, because they can't correct it now as we send it back to them. They have the option of taking what they sent to us and putting it on the ballot, or not putting anything on the ballot. Otherwise, they would have to start the process over and resubmit a brand new version. That would be my belief.
Yeah, yes, Commissioner Ginder, maybe I wasn't clear. That's what I meant when I said the 13-0 vote. If in fact it got on the ballot, and if in fact it was passed by the voters, then I think the city council could consider making a change to the charter, 13-0 vote, to just remove the inconsistency with the law.
Okay, if we're ready to move on a bit, I would just point out that Attorney Bashoon's language for Article 4 is a very simple change to what was proposed by the City Council, striking, as she said, striking the "or special" words before election and on a date allowed under Minnesota election law, striking those two sections, so it has to be at a general election. So with that, I think it would be helpful to take a look at the proposed language that came in from, I believe, Commissioner Ginder, and it's in the section of your packet that's headed with the title Proposed Work Group Revisions, understanding that the entire work group has not voted on anything yet, but it was a title. And going down to the very end of the Section 4 language. And I would believe Commissioner Ginder is probably the best person to explain what he's doing. He has made some more substantive changes to this language, and there it is. And you'll see our may must argument is in there, as well as a few other things. Commissioner Ginder, would you care to walk us through this?
I would, and thank you. The changes that I have suggested here basically make a requirement in Section 2 that any rent stabilization or rent control ordinance, if the council passes it, must go to the voters to be voted on at a general election. And the reason for that is, and this is something I've been trying to figure out over the last month as I've been looking at the statute, and it kind of came to me in the last week, is when you look at the statute itself, it talks about the amendment or ordinance that controls rent control or stabilization must go to the ballot. And in my view, the first section, the council adoption, is really the authorization to enter into this kind of rent control. And you have to remember that because the city doesn't have initiative or referendum right now, we have to, first place, get that ability into the charter to go out for initiative and referendum. But I think when you look at the common meaning of control, it will be the ordinance that is passed that controls. It's not section 1, which gives them the ability to adopt one. It's the passage of the actual ordinance then must be approved by the voters, because that's what controls. And I think that makes it consistent with section 1.4 was talked about by Ms. Bashoon.
Right.
And so that's my suggestion, is that we would have to change this so that if the council passes it, it must go to the voters. And then just for discussion purposes, I changed the number or the amount of votes that would be necessary to pass it. Whenever there's an election on an amendment, there are typically 3 standards that can be used. One is the majority of those voting on the proposed amendment, which is what is in Ms. Bashoon and the City Council's proposal. That's a common one for initiatives. Another common demarcation for a successful passage of a vote is the 51%, which we see specifically in Chapter 410 for amendments generally. Another one that is less common, but that also appears, is that you must have a majority of those voting in the election. So in that case, if somebody doesn't vote on the proposed ballot, so for example, there's been 1,000 votes in the election, but only 500 people voted on the proposed amendment. That means it started out with 500 no votes right out of the gate, because there were 1,000 votes originally. So those are 3 kind of common ones that you see. So I just threw that in for discussion because it came to us with the idea that it was automatically going to be that. If we do move forward on any kind of substitute, we may go back to the 50%. We may want a 51%. I suspect it's unlikely that we go to a majority of all those voting, but that's the reason for that proposal in there. So I don't have any other explanation on that, but if there are questions, I certainly try to address those.
Are there any questions for Commissioner Ginder? I'm looking for hands, and for some reason I don't see a whole lot of hands here. Are there strong feelings about the 51% versus the majority issue? Not sure. Commissioner Rubenstein. You're muted, I think. Oh, you did not
Sorry.
have
I did
Okay.
have my hand up, sorry.
Okay.
No, I don't have strong feelings about majority versus 51%, but I'm a little concerned about having the majority of the votes cast, because it could be just a handful of votes for an important public policy issue. But as I understand, this is just a starting point for discussion, so we can wait and talk about it later.
Okay, and Commissioner Schwarzkopf. And you're muted.
My gut feeling is I would prefer to see it be a majority of all the votes cast.
Okay. All right, and Commissioner Perry, I believe you also had your hand up.
Yes, I agree with Commissioner Rubenstein these are, I'll tip my hand here. I'm concerned about the initiative component of these 2 amendments.
We're not there.
Well, so I think having the number of and Commissioner Rubenstein, if I've got this wrong, if I heard you wrong, but I think you were saying basically what Commissioner Schwarzkopf was saying is that there, when you have an important policy discussion in the public, that should be all of the votes cast rather than just those people who are participating on the ballot question itself. And that's where I would fall on it as well.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, then perhaps we should move to the discussion on Article 1. Because I'm sure we'll have more discussion about this in weeks to come. We did have the memo from Attorney Bashoon some time ago, and she described this, I think, before about the legality of initiatives. She might want to run through that just for a few minutes, that because we had, I believe it was Commissioner Ginder had asked her about, can we have single topic initiatives? And then that raises the issue if this is kind of opening the door to other things. But perhaps Attorney Bashoon could just give her a read on her memo that was dated April 27th.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there really isn't a lot of case law on this issue, whether or not I haven't found anything to show a court case where somebody has set up an initiative just for one particular issue. I know, like in Alaska, they do say they have in their constitution and their state law, they do say that you can't do an initiative for certain topics. In general, I would say, you know, a lot of cities like St. Paul, they have a rent initiative for any topic. But I think our charter allows us to be able to determine what kind of city we want to run and how our city is set up and what the structure of our city is. And because of that, I think it makes sense that we can decide that we want to only allow the voters to bring petitions forward through initiative for certain issues. I think that's in the purview of the city. It's in the purview of all the rights that we have as a charter city. And it makes total sense. And it makes sense, especially with this particular rent control statute, which requires us to consider putting it in our charter, and also allows us to do an initiative for rent control. So it makes sense that the city could consider one particular issue, which is rent control, which could be a major issue in a city, and decide that it wants to have the initiative just for that one particular topic. And so I saw no law that prohibits it. I see laws that allow us to that give us leeway in being able to do so. And that's why I believe that legally we can put forward an initiative only for one topic.
Okay. Are there any questions for Attorney Bashoon about this specific memo about the legality, her interpretation of the legality, before we get into the actual text of the ordinance? All right, let's go to the text of the ordinance. She's been very clear. She described before that, and this is not a discussion of do we want to support this at all or not. Right now, we're just looking at what technical issues are there with this or their proposed ordinance. And I think she struck, as she said, the council cannot enact an ordinance without change. They have to, okay, it's down in section 5, city council action on petition. And in fact, they have to take it back to the voters. And I think then she got rid of the special election laws, and that was it. Is there any other discussion on technical issues with this ordinance other than we may not want to do it at all? any questions from commissioners? No, then I think that is, that concludes that section. Was it number 6 or so forth? And I guess my question for the work group is moving forward on this language. And, oh, I should back up and say, I think Commissioner Ginder was talking to David Schultz about possibly doing a presentation on initiative. I don't know, Peter, have you, he was saying he was available in late May, maybe? Where do we stand with that?
Thank you. I haven't had contact recently with him, but I know that he would not be available until at least after May 18th. And so the question is whether I want to try and schedule him for a date after that. One of the issues that I see is unless we're going to do a special meeting of the entire Charter Commission, we need to have our recommendation on this matter in time for the June meeting, which is, a few weeks away. So, I think much of what Professor Schultz would say is kind of replicated in one of the documents he did submit to me. That's part of our information library on this topic, as well as some of the other materials that we gathered. I mean, in brief, he's not a fan of initiative. And so I think that, it's a presentation that we might find interesting. I don't know that it's absolutely necessary, because I think many of us have our feelings about initiative already. And I know that we have to really start thinking seriously about the substance of rent control, initiative, and referendum, and where we are on the entire thing. So that's a long answer to what was really a short question.
Okay, so it sounds like I will agree. I am not getting an overwhelming support for the initiative ordinance. I just, unless somebody's not saying something and they're being quietly unenthusiastic, I don't know. Especially since I have no idea, other than the fact it was mentioned in the statute, why the council pushed it. I mean, there's no discussion about the desirability or why this is needed, and that I find that disturbing, I guess. So, Peter, what you're saying is we need to look to a final meeting before the June Charter Commission meeting to come up with our final recommendations. Is that correct? Unless people are prepared to do it right now, and I don't know if people are.
I think we need maybe to schedule a couple of meetings, because I think to some degree we want to focus a little bit of discussion on rent control. And I think in my case, I share your feeling that most of us aren't in favor of initiative. The referendum is a different issue for me because, as I may have mentioned earlier, in the absence of that state law, the city council would have had the legislative authority to pass rent control without any special laws or without going to the voters. And so if we tell the council that, hey, we don't agree with initiative and we don't necessarily agree with rent control, but that's really a legislative decision that should be made by a legislative body. And so we'll give you the power to do it, but you still have to take it back to the voters as required by the new state law for referendum. So that's kind of how I see this, and that's why the idea of breaking these out into two separate ordinances is important, because you could send back one that says, council will give you the power to do this as long as it's approved at an election. Or you could just say, we're so vehemently opposed to the idea of initiative, referendum, and rent control in general that we reject everything, which then lets them decide whether they want to put it on as a flawed matter or not.
Okay, but you're thinking, I'm still only seeing enough substance for one more meeting. I'm trying to figure out what the second meeting would be.
Okay. If the members of the group think we can handle this in one meeting, I am fine with that. But if we don't do February 18th, then we
February?
Excuse me. May 18th, then we're stuck on May 25th, which would be the last one before that. So I don't know if we want to try and do two meetings or one. But maybe that's we should what does the body feel about that in general?
Okay, I'm looking for thoughts from members of the work group, number of meetings, dates, and substance of those meetings. Does anyone have a comment, question, whatever? Everybody's fine with having Maddie schedule 2 meetings? Or would you prefer to consolidate it into one if you think we can get our work done? I see Commissioner Perry's hand is raised.
Yeah, so I don't know if we'll need 2 meetings, but I would schedule them so that we have them available to be on the safe side. I think there is, if we end up going into a discussion about whether we get into saying we're not going to do anything on initiative, but we're going to do something different, a substitute motion on referendum, then I think, and we get into the discussion of whether we want to do anything on that at all, I think it may end up being a longer discussion and we may end up needing 2 meetings. But I just for administrative purposes, I would schedule both and use the one and, hope for the best. And it turns out to be 1 meeting.
Hope for the best, plan for the worst. Okay, we can do that. Commissioner Rubenstein, you had your hand up.
Just to say that I agree with Commissioner Perry.
Okay, so I think it sounds like, unless I hear from anyone else, that we should ask Maddie to schedule 2 meetings for us, if that's okay with you, Maddie. The 18th and the 25th. On the 18th, then our agenda would be, I would suggest that we start with the initiative ordinance and discuss that and see how quickly we can decide how we want to go, and then attack the Article 4 question, because that will have considerably more discussion. I would also ask the work group before those meetings, if you would please gather your thoughts. If you have other amendments, things to consider, parts of the language proposed by Commissioner Ginder, because that will certainly be part of our discussions, that you want to question, you want to have more background on, please bring that information with you so that we can have a full discussion at the meeting. Is there anything else to discuss? Commissioner Ginder, did you have anything else?
I did not. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Okay, then I believe we have concluded all of the business to come before the meeting of the Charter Commission's Rent Stabilization Work Group. And without objection, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.